So how does Dillian Whyte beat Moses Itauma? How does Dillian Whyte beat Moses Itauma? That's a good question. Now, I'm going to try and make a case for the best version of Dillian Whyte. Now, Moses is seen as the next greatest or the next best thing coming out of the heavyweight scene, particularly in British boxing. I've even seen suggestions of fighting Usyk, but that should be way too early for that type of challenge. But what would Dillian Whyte need to do to be successful, or what other versions of Dillian Whyte that would prove to be a handful for Moses Itauma? Now, I went through Dillian Whyte's resume, just some of his resume, and I looked at the Anthony Joshua fight. I've always stated that I was very impressed with Dillian Whyte versus Anthony Joshua. I was very impressed with Dillian Whyte versus Anthony Joshua. Now, under that fight, he had a good double jab, and that double jab, it broke up Anthony Joshua's rhythm, but it also led to the straight right, left hook. So he was throwing 3 punches, 4 punches, and in that fight, and I think Paulie Malignaggi mentioned this, particularly in round 2, he utilized the catch, what is it called? The catch and shoot. So you catch a shot and then you shoot. And I believe Anthony Joshua threw a right hand. I don't know if it was a straight right or a hook. But Dillian Whyte, he caught it and then he countered with that devastating left hook. And he nearly knocked Anthony Joshua out. Now, what was interesting about this fight was obviously the combinations, but also he was trained under Jonathan Banks. Jonathan Banks, my understanding is that Jonathan Banks had guidance from the great Emmanuel Stewart. Emmanuel Stewart trained Lennox Lewis amongst other world champions and is considered, or was considered, one of the greatest trainers of all time. So Jonathan Banks was a really good trainer. He didn't stay with him long, but under Jonathan Banks' guidance, I felt like Dillian Whyte was really good. He was fast, he was powerful, he had a good work rate, and I really liked that version of Dillian Whyte. But then you had the version of Dillian Whyte that fought Joseph Parker. And Joseph Parker recently has gone up exponentially under the guidance of Andy Lee. But when Joseph Parker fought Dillian Whyte, it was, I would say, a lighter Joseph Parker, a Joseph Parker that didn't, a good fighter. I believe at that time he was a former champion and he had good boxing intelligence, maybe not great boxing intelligence at the time. The difference between Joseph Parker today to the one that fought Dillian Whyte, I think, is the boxing intelligence. I think that's one of the markers of difference. However, in that fight, Dillian Whyte was he was bigger. I think he was trained by Tibbs for that fight. And again, he had that left hook counter. He was looking for it all the time. And there was one point where he catches, I think he caught the right hook to the body. So Joseph Parker threw a right hook to the body, he catches it, throws a left hook. And he was also countering, he would mostly counter with the left hook. Sometimes he would counter with the right hand left hook. And also he would even counter with the body work. This was a very strong Dillian Whyte, a very rough Dillian Whyte. Kind of reminded me a little bit like a Riddick Bowe. He came in there to really rough up Joseph Parker. And I think those two versions of Dillian Whyte, the version against Anthony Joshua and the version against Joseph Parker, they are strong. That's a strong Dillian Whyte. Also, if you look at his fight against, now he fought Derek Chisora twice, and both of those fights were wars. I recently just rewatched the second fight, and I noticed in the second fight, one of the things that I couldn't kind of remember in that second fight was how high his guard was. He had a very high guard against Derek Chisora in the second fight. His hand placement was very high. And also in the second fight, he did something that I don't see him typically do, and that's the pull counter. So every time Derek Chisora threw a jab, he would throw a right hand over the top, and he was very effective with this. He actually landed a pull counter in round 1 that nearly knocked Derek Chisora out. For those that don't know, Floyd Mayweather, master of the pull counter. And also in that fight, Derek Chisora, he presented a different challenge. So Joseph Parker was kind of using more lateral movement, was more of a fast fighter, but Derek Chisora was getting his head on Dillian Whyte's chest, and Dillian Whyte would just create a little angle and throw a little short uppercut, and sometimes he would get the left hook to the body, but his real emphasis was on counter punching in that fight. And he was good in that fight, but he was almost a bit too economical. He nearly got out hustled in that fight. But I think Dillian Whyte's composure and his boxing intelligence was good, and the left hook came through again. What a brutal left hook that was. Brutal finish. And I think those versions of Dillian Whyte would give him a chance. Unfortunately, many would say that's the Dillian Whyte of yesterday, not the Dillian Whyte of today. And I can see that argument. But one needs to remember that Dillian Whyte has fought at a high level for a very considerable amount of time. And if Dillian Whyte, A, has anything left, and B, comes prepared, this could potentially be a very difficult fight for Moses Itauma. A very difficult fight for Moses Itauma, because potentially, if this goes past the early rounds and he doesn't score like a blistering knockout, Dillian Whyte can present puzzles that Moses Itauma has never seen in a professional ring. Now, he may have seen it in sparring. We don't know generally what goes on in sparring apart from the people that are there, but he will set traps, and the left hook counter is probably the most formidable thing that Moses Itauma will have to deal with up until this point. So the question though is that left hook going to be as elite as it was? I mean, it was all of his devastating performances involved that left hook counter. He had a brutal knockout of Lucas Brown. That was another brutal knockout. So it kind of, the question is, what is the recent form of Dillian Whyte? And there's a few issues there. Number one, he hasn't had much regular form, so that's a negative. And his fight against, I can't remember the name, I think it was Tete. Apologies, I can't remember the name, but he did not look good in that fight. He looked like he had a lot of ring rust, and his reflexes didn't look great. So the implications are not great. However, I do believe Dillian Whyte will have Buddy McGirt training him, and Buddy McGirt is a very credible trainer. So that's a positive sign. And also there's rumors that Dillian Whyte is in good shape, or he's lean. And it's important to realize that just because a boxer is lean doesn't mean that they're in boxing shape. A good example of this would be when Riddick Bowe, the one who beat Evander Holyfield twice, fought Andrew Golota in the rematch. Riddick Bowe came in super light against Andrew Golota in the rematch, but he didn't have his legs, and clearly he may have looked in better shape, but he wasn't in boxing shape. So it doesn't necessarily mean he's in good boxing shape, but if he is in good boxing shape, and if he is shaking off that ring rust, and if he can bring back that left hook and bring back that body work, then, and if he is listening to Buddy McGirt, because Buddy McGirt is, he's very knowledgeable in the boxing context, and he will look at the tapes and he will see things. And if Dillian Whyte can come in on form, this can be a very, very competitive fight. Now, clearly, I think a lot of people are expecting Moses Itauma to just blast out Dillian Whyte. That's a possibility, particularly with the ring rust and lack of ring time. However, if Dillian Whyte can get through the early parts of the fight, and if he can get this left hook counter going, and if he can get his jab off, and if he can get the fight up close and start introducing the body work and start setting the traps, this could be a very compelling fight. And there is a scenario where Dillian Whyte could win. I emphasize the could. So I guess the question would be, what would Dillian Whyte need to do? I think the Battle of the Jabs would be important. I haven't watched loads of Moses Itauma, but when he fought McLean, that was a phenomenal performance. I noticed he threw, first of all, he's a southpaw, so the jab's coming from the right hand, and he threw like a short right hand and a big overhand left. I guess there's a few ways to deal with that. Number one, when he's throwing that short right hand, if you can time it, you can throw a left hook over that right hand. That's one way of dealing with it. Or you can step back, draw out the right hook, maybe catch the overhand left, and then counter over that. So that's a combination that he's used in devastating fashion. So, you know, it's important that he's prepared for that. Moses Itauma has great speed and great power from what I've seen. So he needs to nullify that, and that's going to be difficult. But if he can bring it into the middle rounds and introduce the body work, then that will slow him down and affect his confidence potentially. And if he can get this left hook off, and like I said, Dillian Whyte has a world-class left hook, this could make Moses Itauma less confident in punching at or through the target. From what I've seen, Moses Itauma can really punch through the target in devastating fashion. And I believe Moses is trained by Ben Davidson, and a lot of his fighters, they punch through the target in a very effective manner. And I am worried for Dillian Whyte in the beginning of the fight. But if he can get through the early stages of the fight, this could be a competitive and compelling contest. And I think it's important to remember that the nature of Dillian Whyte is of a fighter. He's a fighter. He's a confident guy. He's a warrior. He's not going to lay down. So for me, there's the potential that this could be a really brutal fight. It could be similar to the Anthony Joshua fight, and it will give us a good understanding of how good Moses Itauma is.